I think WTO has been fundamentally weakened because of its overreaching, and that Trump was very much a symptom of an underlying problem rather than the factor that drove the world economic system apart. So I think Trump made us in some ways see more clearly that we were in an unsustainable path. So I don't think it's really feasible. It's not going to be feasible to return to a kind of a status quo ante and to revive the World Trade Organization precisely because of the kinds of tensions that I've discussed in my remarks. And therefore, I do hope that we will end up with a strong WTO because I'm not a fan of a lot of the WTO agreements, but for example, I'm a fan of the WTO dispute settlement procedure. It's really remarkable, but I think it should apply, in a much narrower range of areas than is currently the practice. So I do that, and I like it that it's, as I was discussing before, it's a multilateral institutions. Ghana matters as much as the United States does. I think that's good, but we're not. I don't think even with a Biden administration, we're not going back to the old war, and we need to work out a new settlement with China in particular that will have to operate by somewhat different rules than what's currently inscribed in the WTO agreements. What's interesting about China, which obviously is the greatest beneficiary of the post-1990 global economic system, but China presents a paradoxical case because even though China was a great beneficiary of the post-1990 system, China played the globalization game not by post-1990 rules, but actually by Bretton Woods rules. What that means is that China managed its currency, restricted capital flows, engaged in all kinds of industrial policies, subsidized industries and exports, of course, had wide amounts of, state enterprises as a kind of a social safety net, did all the kinds of things that you were allowed to do under the Bretton Woods regime, but you were not allowed to do in the post-1990 policy regime. Secrets of China is much more that it actually ascribed to the Bretton Woods rules than the post-hyperglobalization rules. And I was lucky that while it was pursuing these strategies, that the rest of the world basically just dropped all their barriers down, and they presented an open market to China. So it's probably true that if other countries had been a little bit more selective and gradual in their liberalization, that maybe China's growth would have been a little bit lower, but not a whole lot. I think I don't think one can imagine, for example, that the United States would have been liberalized against China on a much slower path with occasional, much more aggressive use of safeguards to protect employment in the United States. That might have taken a little bit of growth out of China, but maybe would not have gotten Trump elected 2016, because the evidence we have is that, in fact, those parts of the United States that were most adversely affected by the Chinese export shock were precisely the ones that shifted towards Trump and in some sense cost Hillary Clinton the election back in 2016. So I think for the world as a whole, it might have been a good bargain to have China grow a little bit less, have a somewhat more protection and somewhat less deep integration after the 1990s, and have avoided 4 years of Trump. The big advantage of the export-oriented industrialization strategy that a wave of countries pursued, Japan in the 50s and 60s, and of course ultimately most successfully China since the 1990s, manufacturing, especially export-oriented manufacturing, can be a very powerful engine for growth. But unfortunately, I think that the world has changed significantly, the world economy, and the possibilities of significant and rapid industrialization in the latecomers, like the sub-Saharan African countries, are now much, much more limited. For one thing, there's much more international competition, so it's harder to get a beachhead. Once you have had a China there, it's really getting very hard and there's much less natural or man-made protection in the system. So it's much harder for countries in Africa to develop sort of beachheads or niches in manufacturing. Secondly, perhaps more fundamentally, manufacturing and global value chains have become extremely skill intensive, much more so than they were 30, 40 years ago. So even very labor abundant countries are finding it very difficult to put a lot of workers into manufacturing. And so we're not going to be getting these kinds of manufacturing-led growth experiences and the experience of relatively more successful industrializing countries in Africa like Ethiopia shows that the growth is not coming out of manufacturing. When I think of globalization, I don't necessarily think of that this is a kind of a unidirectional thing, that you're even you're globalizing more or you're globalizing less. I think in my discussion, I pointed out that there are certain areas where I think we've gone too far in globalization. There are certain areas where we've gone, not far enough. So I think the example I gave was, I think in the area of, trade liberalization of services and financial globalization, I think there are many areas where we've gone too far. But I don't think we've gone nearly far enough with respect to an area like labor mobility, temporary work visas, and schemes of that kind. Similarly, I think there are non-economic areas where I think we should globalize more. I think we should be much more globalized in having a global public health regime. We should be more globalized with respect to having, global environmental and climate change agreements. Because those are true global public goods. Those are really where there's very strong argument for stronger globalization, stronger global governance. So I think our priorities ought to be that we should avoid thinking in terms of pro or anti-globalization or more globalization, deglobalization, and focus on areas where I think there are very strong arguments for globalization and where been done enough. And areas where we've created more political costs and adverse distributing effects, and it's really worth it, where I don't think it's much benefit for pushing.